So I thought I would talk about reflective coping, initially in illness and death, but I thought that given that the theme also included birth, I would try and say something a little bit broader about finitude more broadly conceived. And by that I mean thinking about finitude as delimiting life on both ends of it. So normally I think when people talk about finitude, they mean mortality, but finitude can equally also mean natality. So if we go back to Lucretius and his symmetry argument, he suggests that non-existence after death, posthumous non-existence, is equivalent, metaphysically equivalent or psychologically equivalent to prenatal non-existence. And I want to not talk about the symmetry argument as such and whether it's a successful argument or not, but to really try and take this symmetry in order to focus on three notions. The first two I've mentioned, natality and mortality, and the third is vulnerability. So if we think about natality as the event that starts human life, and mortality or death as the end of that life, in between, life is not exempt from a certain element of vulnerability, openness, or dependence, if you like. And I want to try and think about the moral implications or the existential implications of these three terms and their significance for us. So, in other words, I want to say something quite broad, and I'm drawing on a host of very reputable resources, as you will see in a minute, to say something extremely broad about the consequences of mortality, natality, and vulnerability. Now, when I think about vulnerability, I mean, of course, physical vulnerability, which includes illness, but also includes a host of other susceptibilities, physical susceptibilities we might have to accident, to trauma, and so on. And I also want to think about vulnerability as psychological. So to think about the ways in which grief or trauma or bereavement might impact on our lives in ways that reveal our vulnerability very forcefully, I think. So I said I was going to draw on three reputable sources. The first is Sigmund Freud, and I will talk a little bit about his essay on transience, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. The second reputable source is Pierre Hadot in his essay on the Stoic and Epicurean thinkers and on Goethe. Only the present is our happiness. And the third is Alistair MacIntyre in his lecture, a book based on a series of lectures he gave, Dependent Rational Animal, where he suggests that we need to reconfigure ethics in light of this vulnerability and susceptibility to affliction that characterize human life, as he argues very persuasively in that book. So, since I can't see any of you, is it okay? Can you hear me so far? Is it audible and understandable?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Okay, so, and I'm hoping to draw on these three sources to suggest three things. On the Freudian scheme in On Transience, to suggest that daring to attach or to love or to invest in the world is one consequence of our finitude, natality, and vulnerability. Following Hadot, to suggest that relishing the richness of the present can be a valuable lesson to human life. And finally, with MacIntyre, to think a little bit about what a reconfigured ethics might look like. And I won't have time to do any of these in any great detail, as you might have guessed. Okay, so just a brief, to add to my arsenal of reputable sources, I'll add the poet Rilke and his ninth Duino elegy. And it's a shame I can't use PowerPoint, but I would have put the text up on the slide, but you'll have to trust me. This is just a few lines from the ninth elegy. Once for each thing, just once, no more. And we too, just once, and never again. But to have been this once completely, even if only once, To have been one with the earth seems beyond undoing. And I think this short stanza is very much in line with Freud's views on transience. So this very short essay, it's really just 2 or 3 pages, was written in 1915, obviously during World War I. And Freud describes in this essay a walk in the countryside accompanied by a poet and another friend. And they look around them and they see the spring, the sunshine, the flowers, the mountains, and so on. And the poet in the company says he admired the beauty of the scene around us, but felt no joy in it. Why did he feel no joy? He felt no joy because he was disturbed by the thought of this beauty's extinction. And this is another quote: like all human beauty and all the beauty and splendor that men have created or may create. And he continues and says, all that he would otherwise have loved and admired seemed to him to be shorn of its worth by the transience which was its doom. So, of course, the fundamental insight is one that is shared by any sensible philosopher, which is that we are transient and that everything around us is transient. So beauty and splendor and everything that humanity has created and nature is all transient. But this proneness to decay can lead to one of 2 reactions. The first is the poet's reaction, which Freud describes as aching despondency. And the second, of the other friend who joined them on the walk, is a reaction of rebellion. So this man rebels because he demands a sort of immortality that the facts of the reality around him cannot supply. And Freud, in his understated way, says, what is painful may nonetheless be true. So, of course, the question or the challenge for Freud is, how can you dispute the pessimistic view that transience involves a loss of worth, as the poet describes, without being naive to the facts that constitute or delimit human life, the facts of natality, mortality, and vulnerability. So, Freud says to the poet, you feel this aching despondency because you see the beauty, but you also see its proneness to decay enveloped in it somehow. And you think that transience implies a decrease in value, but Freud exclaims, on the contrary, he thinks it leads to an increase in value. And I quote again, transience value is scarcity value in time. So when we limit the possibility of enjoyment, when a flower, we can enjoy the beauty of a flower for just one day, that in fact raises its value, Freud suggests. And a flower that blossoms only for a single night does not seem to us on that account less lovely. And this, of course, echoes some of the Stoics' thoughts about a perfect moment of happiness, and the analogy they use of a perfect circle, saying that a big circle isn't any more of a circle than a little circle. And Aristotle's similar comments on whiteness, a white object being no less white if it exists for only one day. The problem is that the poet remains unconvinced, and what he experiences is a revolt against the threat of the mourning that he already sees preconceived or embedded in the beauty that he experiences. So the experience of beauty gives a foretaste of mourning its loss, says Freud. In the next step in this short essay, he connects this capacity for enjoyment, for investment, for love, with his fundamental concept of the libido. And he says, we invest libidinally in objects, and when these are destroyed or lost, we mourn. And of course, war for Freud represents the ultimate source for the need to mourn. So what we need to do is to embrace transience, or to accept that the condition of enjoying beauty, of giving value, of attaching worth to things, it comes with transience as its cost, and comes with mourning as a possibility for threat that is always there and has to be taken as the flip side of the enjoyment itself. So this is Freud. Moving on to Goethe and Pierre Hadot. So I should probably say something about Hadot's essay. In the essay, he draws on a host of sources, mainly Stoic and Epicurean thinkers, but also on Goethe's comments about living in the present as saying yes to the world. And what Hadot wants to describe is a particular ability to seize the moment, to experience the healthiness of the moment that characterizes certain ancient modes of thinking, and to suggest that knowing how to utilize the present is an important lesson for contemporary thinkers as well. Because it implies a very secular focus on being content with the present, with earthly existence, rather than expecting it to come good in some posthumous afterlife of one sort or another. And he contrasts this ancient idea of having a decisive instant, the kairos, with the idea of chronos, of chronology or time. And the decisive instant for Goethe, says Hadot, involves being able to know how to utilize the present, recognizing and seizing the decisive instant. And he gives an example of a photographer who knows exactly when to click on the button to open the shutters, as a modern example of such seizing the moment. And of course, such attention to the present has both aesthetic and moral meaning. He laments that we no longer know how to live in the present because we privilege the future so much, and consider the present to be both trivial and banal. Now, the Stoics, of course, had a very different view of the present, as did the Epicureans. And as a form of philosophical therapy or a therapeutic mode, Hadot proceeds to suggest what some of the ways of being in the present may have been for ancient thinkers, and how we might utilize or think about utilizing similar spiritual exercises in modern life. So I'll talk briefly about the Stoics and then turn to Epicureans. So for the Stoics, the ability to delimit the present was an enormous skill worthy of much spiritual exercise and labor in order to develop that ability. And the point of delimiting the present is that only the present belongs to us and only the present depends upon us. And of course, the latter claim is something we might particularly want to contest. But if we think about the present, and we think of the possibility of being purely in the present, such a possibility would free us from both regrets about the fixed past that doesn't belong to us because it's already happened, we can't change it, and about anxiety about the unknown future, which is beyond our control. So the past has already been, and therefore we cannot control it or change it. The future is unknown and undetermined by us, or by us solely, and therefore is also beyond our control. What remains to us is the present. Now, with sufficient spiritual training, goes the Stoic thought, we can train ourselves to be purely in the present, to cease experiencing regrets about the past and anxiety about the future, which are, of course, two major sources of mental anguish. And we can then hope to find a way to be entirely in the present and then make that moment a happy moment. So happiness say for the Stoics, can only be found in the present. And again, going back to the analogy of the circle, there is no advantage here to quantity over quality, because one instant of happiness is much the same as an eternity of happiness, according to Stoic thought. And therefore, we shouldn't aspire to have more. And of course, the views of Thomas Nagel about death might come to mind for some of you, when he suggests that more life is almost always better than less life. But the Stoic insistence is that what matters is the ability to isolate ourselves from the worries about the future and regrets about the past, and to isolate a moment in which we can be genuinely present and genuinely happy. Now, of course, this requires a huge amount of spiritual and mental effort. We need attention, we need vigilance, continuous tension, concentrated upon each and every moment, say the Stoics. And Hadot quotes Marcus Aurelius saying, "This is enough for you." And it means in both senses. First, that this moment may be brief, but it is enough for you. And this moment is enough, even if it is a simple or banal or trivial moment, is enough for you, is sufficient for happiness. Enough to keep you busy, occupied, and happy if you are indeed entirely present in that moment. So on this account, we want to embrace transience, as Freud suggests, or understand its essential nature for human value, but then also try and invest as much spiritual effort as we can in finding happiness, not in some putative future, but in the present moment, which, as I just quoted Aurelius, is enough for us. Okay, now looking briefly at Epicureanism, we find similar views, obviously couched in a very, very different metaphysics, very, very different ethics, but nonetheless quite similar. Similar in the desire to rid ourselves of mental anguish in order to reach tranquility, mental painlessness, mental lack of suffering. So Epicureans suggest that we're tormented by vast, hollow desires that cannot be satisfied in the present. And therefore we must learn to enjoy the pleasure available to us in the present without being distracted from that enjoyment. And on this view, only thoughts about what is pleasurable or positive are allowed into the present. And the quality of pleasure, again, doesn't depend on the quantity of the desire satisfied or the duration of pleasure. And the best pleasure is the one that is infused with the least amount of worry and which ensures peace of mind, ataraxia. And of course, the view here is that ridding ourselves of all forms of worry, regret, anxiety, and other forms of mental anguish is incredibly difficult. So Epicureanism more generally isn't suggesting that we can entirely rid ourselves. That is an ideal state, but we can find pleasure by aiming at the least amount of worry and the least amount of anxiety in order to maximize our chances of having this tranquility. And of course, the Epicurean view is that we can satisfy, or we should train ourselves to satisfy only the desires which are natural and necessary, and thus develop further independence from external objects. And finally, just one more quote from Epicurus before I move on to MacIntyre. This is from the Vatican Sayings, this number 14. He says, "We're only born once. Twice is not allowed. And it is necessary that we shall be no more for all eternity. And yet you, who are not master of tomorrow, keep putting off your joy. Yet life is vainly consumed in these delays, and each of us dies without ever having known peace. Okay, so now I want to say something very brief about natality, because so far I've talked mostly about mortality. And I think some of the ideas of Sarah Ruddick from her book Maternal Thinking are ones that might be useful for us, are trying to understand the significance of natality a little bit beyond this idea of vulnerability and dependence. But she's very much in line with McIntyre, who I'm going to come to next. Of course, she suggests that the kinds of experiences that are characteristic of women are moral experiences. So she talks about caring for a dependent as a deeply moral experience, and she talks about birth as a deeply moral experience. And this, of course, emphasizes the non-triviality of the private sphere, which I think both of the previous talks touched on. Now, of course, if you think about the kind of moral values that might be developed in focusing on these experiences as moral experiences, these might be an understanding and appreciation of interdependence, of community, of connection, of sharing, of emotion, of trust, and seeing a lot of value in a process rather than in a finished product. This is intrinsic to child rearing, as any of you with children will know. And she talks about maternal practice as being one of preservation, growth, and acceptability. So what we're trying to do is provide nurturing through what she calls preservative love, to provide nurturing and support for growth, and to provide moral acceptability in the form of moral and social training. Now, she also thinks that three aspects of the body come into play in this understanding of the centrality of women's experiences as moral experiences: natality, sexuality, and mortality. And she suggests that birth undermines the individuation of bodies. So here's just one brief quote, because I know time is running out, where she ties together some of her thoughts about birth with thoughts about death. And this is from Maternal Thinking, page 206. To tell a maternal history, it is necessary to look again with trusting eyes at sexuality and birth. The history begins at the beginning with a birthing woman and infant, whose relationship, however disturbing, is also emblematic of promise. In this history, a body is a testament to hope. Every body, and therefore every death, counts. The promise of birth includes a dying well tended and a death well mourned. So I think this might be something we will want to touch on in the general discussion, the kind of intrinsic connection between natality and mortality that Ruddick identified, of course underpinned by the body. A body is a testament to hope, as she says. So I'll close with McIntyre, who starts out by suggesting, truly I think, that we are vulnerable to affliction, we are dependent on others throughout our life, but particularly in the beginning of life and at the end of it, right after birth and just before death. And how we cope with extreme situations like trauma, bereavement, war, illness, he says, is only partly up to us. And what we don't acknowledge often, and I think McIntyre is particularly talking about the history of philosophy here, or philosophy, well, in some, right in the beginning of the book, he says philosophy from Plato to more, but of course we might think this is particularly pertinent to contemporary philosophy as it's done today. We don't acknowledge fully how much of our survival is owed to others, and how much of our flourishing is actually owed to others. And he suggests looking at both childhood and old age, which naturally connect to birth and to death, as two places in which that dependency is terribly obvious. However, he says, also the period in between is one in which we remain susceptible, we remain vulnerable, we remain potentially afflicted by any of the external disasters that might descend upon us. However, MacIntyre suggests, the history of ethics contains only passing references to vulnerability and affliction, connection and dependence. And he invites us to think in that lecture series, what would moral philosophy look like if these facts, affliction, vulnerability, and dependence, were taken as central to the human condition? So, what I tried to do in this whistle-stop tour of philosophy is, again, to suggest that, first of all, finitude, I think, has been largely understood as connected to mortality or as almost interchangeable with mortality. But in fact, finitude also points us to prenatal non-existence and to the fact of birth. And I suggested that an understanding, a deep understanding of the consequences of mortality, natality, and vulnerability could be cashed out. This is one suggestion only, there may be many others, as a Freudian call to dare to love or to embrace transience, a Hadoian call to relish the richness of the present, and a MacIntyrean call to reconfigure ethics in light of these reflections. Thank you very much.